Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a progressive campaign agency that specialises in community organising. We work with non-profit and community-based organisations, trade unions, businesses and social democratic parties across the globe to develop campaign strategies, train engagement staff in leadership and power building, and help you execute your campaign with data-driven tactics and actions. And in 2022, Dunn Street will continue to work with folks that want to share their stories and inspire others, take action and organise communities for change. To find out how you can partner with Dunn Street, hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. Today's episode is also proudly brought to you by Morris Blackburn Lawyers. Are you highly organised and love working in a fast-paced environment? Morris Blackburn, Australia's leading plaintiff law firm, is looking for an executive legal assistant to support the national leader on a 12-month fixed-term contract based in Melbourne. This will include coordinating and supporting the leader with a high-level administrative assistance, coordinating documents with strong attention to detail, building and managing relationships with key internal and external stakeholders, and obviously providing excellent client service. To apply for this wonderful job, simply go to morrisblackburn.com.au/careers. Hello and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast out every Friday that dives into the progressive campaign and issues of the day and the people leading from home and abroad. And we continue on our journey of unpacking the 2021 federal election in which Anthony Albanese and the Labor Party were elected to government for the first time since 2010. And we're going to look at New South Wales on today's episode, the premier state, as we like to be told by our cousins north of the border. And to help me unpack the results in New South Wales, we're joined by Elliot Stein from Hawker Britton. Now, I will just say this. At the time of recording, Elliot worked for Hawker Britton. Elliot has now been snapped up into the federal government's ministry team. He's been hired as a staff member for one of the ministers. So just to be clear, this recording was done whilst he was working for a private firm. And obviously his views here do not reflect those of his boss or the ministry. And he's not doing a podcast whilst he's on the payroll of the government. And we just needed to say that. And if this was a Liberal Party podcast, they wouldn't bother doing that. And in fact, they'd probably throw him out, a backhander as well, some money, some cash on the side. That's how the way the Liberals do it. But they can get away with that kind of stuff. We can't. We have to be better than that. So that's today's episode. Looking forward to hearing from Elliot on that. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Stitcher. And if you like the show, give us 5 stars on whatever podcast app you use. And for all the updates, follow Dunn Street on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. Okay, let's get to today's episode. We are taping this one on a Wednesday morning on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. And to help me break down the New South Wales post-election debrief, I'm joined once again on the line from Thurl. I hope I pronounced that correctly. It's a town north of Wollongong. That's all people need to know. He's the director for the Queensland and Northern Territory practice of Hawker Britton. Elliot Stein, welcome back to Socially Democratic.
G'day, Stephen. Good to see you again.
I haven't seen you since election night with our live telecast. And David Fetty tried to beat you up about getting an answer out of you about Fowler. I can't let you off the hook now because I've got you for an hour, so we're going to get to that eventually. But how have you recovered from election night and the victory?
Very, very well. Thanks again for having us on that live broadcast, which I think on your current projections had about 2 million listeners and viewers, I think, over the course of the episode is the latest.
And going up.
It's good. And, looking forward to... I think you and I joked the day after the election that this podcast would be calling the things I wouldn't say to David on air that I'm ready to say 2 weeks later. So looking forward to the chat.
Wonderful. Same. So for the viewers at home, and I say that jokingly because this is a purely audio medium, to give us a snapshot of New South Wales. The two-party preferred at this point in time is 51.1 to Labor, 48.9 to the coalition. That is a 2.9% swing to the Labor Party. So a good swing for the party up in New South Wales. If we take a look at the primary vote totals and the seats won and lost, Starting with the coalition, they had a terrible night. They lost 6 seats. They currently hold 16. Their primary vote was 36.7, and that is a swing of 5.8% against their primary. The Labor Party picked up 2 seats. We'll talk about them in a moment. So they take their total in the caucus to 26, with a primary vote of 33.4 and a swing against Labor's primary of 1.2. The Greens still don't have a seat in New South Wales. They got 9.9%. They had a swing of 1.2% to them. One Nation, a swing of 3.5% to them. And they're on 4.8%. United Palmer, a swing of 0.5%. And others, which is the big story, I guess, outside of Labor winning government, is all of the Teals. They had a swing of 1.8%, which takes their primary up to 11, which is actually bigger than the Greens. And they picked up 4 seats. Broadly speaking, Elliot, just your top line reflections on the 2PP and then the primary results coming out of New South Wales.
Yeah, so it was a tremendous result in New South Wales, and it's a state that well and truly carried its own and helped deliver majority government. We should say that it was, although it was a net gain of 2, it was obviously 3 seats that we picked up, and we'll dive into that. The story of our 2PP and our primary is sort of reflective of the country, where we did take a hit on primary, but we saw it come back to us quite healthily in a swing towards on 2PP. We said when we spoke before the election, I think I said that New South Wales was the best encapsulation of what Morrison was trying to do, of jettisoning one set of seats to gain another set of seats. And hopefully I said this, but I was definitely thinking of going that's a high risk strategy, and it could be the greatest demonstration of that strategy falling short, of jumping from one lily pad to the other but landing in the drink instead. And that's exactly what happened. You saw quite deliberate abandonment of the seats around the Sydney Heads, with an attempt to go after the seats out along the Parramatta River and west, and it completely fell short, to the point where I particularly enjoy this outcome of the election. There is only one part of New South Wales where you can stand on the beach and be standing in a Liberal seat, and that's Cook, Scott Morrison's seat, Cronulla. There's only one beachfront Liberal-held seat in New South Wales now, and that's the seat of Cook, which I'm sure will be handing out at a by-election in the not too distant future there as well. So it's we'll dive into it a bit more, but with the obviously the Teal or independent movement did extremely well against the Liberals and actually exceeded expectations with the gain of McKellar as well, which was one that we didn't even speak about last time. Obviously, we had the unexpected upset in Fowler, but I do think there is a common thread with those elections, which we'll dive into a little bit later on. But across the board, it was a tremendous Labor result for New South Wales.
Before we talk about the positives from the Labor side, let's actually talk about the negatives for the Liberal Party. I just want to pick up on that point you just said before about the strategy for Morrison to jump from one lily pad to another and fall in the pond. How much do you think that the politics of the pandemic played into voters' minds, and how much of it was a vote against the Morrison doctrine, or how much did New South Wales state politics also play into the results?
Yes, I'll sort of working around those ones. Although there might be some implications for the coming state election in March, I don't think state politics fed into the campaign as much as maybe some of the commentary says it may have played in Victoria. I think by virtue of length of lockdowns and different perceptions of the role of government in in the southern state compared to the premier state. Um, so not as much on the state thing. I think the interesting. I was chatting with a mate last night about the COVID implications, and part of me just thinks that people were so tired after COVID, and to be brutally honest, they just couldn't stand any more of Morrison's bullshit. Like, people were just tired, and then they saw him kicking around, washing people's hair, crash tackling kids, doing the whole routine. And so really I don't think it was a COVID election. I think it was a COVID hangover election where people were just tired of it all. And I saw a fantastic quote from Paul Erickson, the state secretary, in the cover story of the monthly this month. And I think the quote was basically along the lines of, the proposition was, when it came to the crunch in the ballot box, do you want 3 more years of this shit? And we've probably just got ourselves an R rating now in the first 5 minutes. But anyway, it might happen a bit more. But so that's I think, weirdly enough, and compare and contrast to the Queensland state election, the Northern Territory election, and the WA state election, which have all occurred, and the New Zealand election as well, which occurred more in the heat of COVID, and they were definitely definitive COVID elections. This one, I think, is sort of that long tail effect, and partly because the way that he conducted himself during the pandemic as well, Morrison couldn't really play off any positives or strength from that. And really didn't try to. It was amazing how much COVID wasn't mentioned, but I reckon that emotional tiredness is the only word I can think to describe it. That's what I sort of sensed lurking around, that people just wanted to go back to having good, competent government.
It's funny when you think about it now, because just as you started to talk about being in the heat of that COVID period, at that time, I think a lot of us were thinking, if there was an election called now, a federal election that is, there's no way Labor's going to win an election. And we were all kind of watching how Morrison was handling it, because we could see that most other state premiers were doing a very good job, and their approval numbers were high. And Morrison's were reasonably high as well. I'm just trying to think of the moment when things started to turn. I'm guessing it's kind of the vaccine rollout, really. That's when I think people sort of, and I know like Labor people were getting a little bit frustrated with Albo, because he was very quiet. And unlike, say, Peter Malinauskas, who clearly took the strategy of, I'm going to be a team player for Team South Australia, and I'm going to support the government, like openly support the government where I can. But when there are moments I want to sort of call them out, or I've got some suggestions, I'm going to put them forward. Whereas Albo I thought Labor were reasonably quiet through that period, and then the vaccine rollout happened. Is that when you think things started to turn?
I think it was 2 moments, and I for the life of me, I can't put in my head the order of the 2 of them. But just really back on the federal Labor team, I reckon that the federal caucus's predisposition would have been the same as Mally's, which would have been to be to be supportive, to be Team Australia, to get behind it. But it got to a certain point where we just couldn't any further. And I think because we had banked the capital of being responsible and wanting the best and wanting to get through it all, when we did inevitably have to start throwing some punches, it probably had a bit more weight behind it, almost more in sorrow than in anger. So the 2 moments that I would think about, the vaccine rollout, absolutely. But that moment, and Frydenberg did it to Victoria to some extent as well, but the moment where he called WA cave people, I reckon that was a big turning point as well. And it sort of comes back to what we're saying about Morrison's performance during COVID, is he was never quite comfortable in the skin that he had to wear through that moment. Like, he didn't quite like the fact that government was going to be quite central to the response. And although, those early months, he probably played played a blinder of committee national cabinet and leading those initial responses and some of those early performances. Speaking candidly from my own point of view, the best thing that Morrison ever did was when he it was the second or third week of March, and he said to expats living overseas, if you want to come home now. And that's actually what prompted me to come home. It was good, clear messaging. It clearly indicated where the government was going. It had enough anticipation where you could sort of factor it in. And I was being open and honest about the thought process and the thinking of government, which I think is this is a tangent I'll go down quickly, but one of the biggest lessons I've learned over the different years in different sort of crisis portfolios is that there's nothing wrong with taking the public into your confidence when you don't know all the answers. And I thought he did that really well in March 2020 and April 2020. It was quite good. But the longer that it went on, he clearly didn't like that about the job. And that's where you saw pushing everything onto the states, not providing any federal leadership. Then you'd end up with a situation of having this mismatch of different rules in each jurisdiction, which he would then come out and attack the states for not having consistency when he wasn't providing a leadership role, and was quite happy to, have all this bickering, which just frankly strengthened all the incumbent state leaders in their own jurisdictions. Thanks very much. So I think the longer it went on, the more he was trying to sort of wrestle with what he had had to adopt, and then that's when you saw things like taking pot shots at WA. You had Frydenberg treasurer attacking the Victorian government and your sixth lockdown, or whichever one it was. Apologies. So I think that, and then on top of it, then you got to the vaccine rollout. And I it was somewhere around the sort of that middle of the second Sydney lockdown, and when the vaccine rollout was just, a dog's breakfast. My mum said something to me, and she said, "We spent 2 years at home for what?" It's like, what was the point of all that? And the death count was going up, the vaccine rollout was a mess. We'd all stayed home for 2 years to give the federal government time to get their act together, and they dropped it. And I just remember her distinctly saying, just going, what was the point of all of that? And I reckon that sums up the mood around that time really, really well. And I reckon people got to the end of it and said, well, we'll fix you.
Mm. Well, let's talk about how they did fix him. Let's start with the positives that came out of the campaign for Labor. And I want to talk about the seats that we picked up. What do you, starting with more broadly speaking, before we dive into Reid and Bennelong, what do you think is the foundations of success for Labor that enabled them to take those two particular seats? What are the characteristics that when you look at those seats, you go, okay, this is where Labor managed to have some success?
And Robertson as well. And I think it's Robertson as well. And I think it's the same story across all three, actually. And I was digging through them before, trying to find, what particular booth or location or what sort of individual metric. It's actually a very uniform result across those three. And it's the story of the collapse of the Liberal primary, for all the reasons why we just went through. And the success of Labor in holding or increasing our primary slightly, but gaining heavily on 2PP. For me, those three seats have the one thing in common, which is excellent candidate selection. And we had candidates from and of their communities, representative of their communities, from Sally, Jerome, and Gordon are all exceptional candidates with great stories, and worked their behinds off, but were representative of their communities, whether they'd come out of local government or the health system, or from raising families and that sort of stuff. It just came down to, we made some really good calls on candidate picks in those areas. And then overlaid with the collapse of the Liberal primary, that's really the common thread of those three seats.
Looking at I wanted to talk about. You and I spoke about this before the show. And I actually want to bring it up now because I'm looking at the way that the primary. There's obviously a lot of conversation at the moment within Labor circles on social media and in the columns of or the newspapers about Labor's strength in our base, and we've seen. Well, certainly, if you look in Victoria, if you look at metropolitan Melbourne, there are swings against Labor on our primary in our heartland, not just in the west and the north, but also in the southeast, to radical far right, mostly radical far right fringe nut job parties like Palmer and One Nation. A little bit to the Greens as well, but substantially to those parties. You move in towards the CBD to our held seats that are in the inner sort of ring. Same deal, swings against us on our primary, but to the Greens or to left-leaning parties. I think the Socialists might have picked up some swings to one of the seats in Wills or something. The only weird one actually is McEwen, and that was the one we were worried about. And actually, there were swings to the Greens more than into the sort of the right-wing nut jobs. Now, what's the story in New South Wales? Because there's something I've just noticed about the difference in the only difference in Victoria. The only time we saw swings to Labor are the seats that had a field campaign. So Dunkley and so in terms of Labor held, Dunkley and Corangamite, and the seats that we picked up. And if you look at the primary vote in New South Wales, in the seats that you picked up, same deal, had swings on our primary. Sally got a swing of 4.4% to her. That was the biggest swing of any of the candidates on primary. In Bennelong, Jerome got a swing of 3.7% to him. Once again, the biggest of all the swings. What are you seeing broadly about what's happening in this current seats that we hold, where we're seeing small swings against us on our primary, but then it comes back in spades in our 2PP? But what's the difference in those particular seats of Bennelong, Reid, and Robertson?
I think I think the big difference in those seats is, which is a bit obvious, but because they were seats that were hunting against the Liberals in, voters in those areas knew that if they wanted to turf them, they had to come over the fence. And on top of great campaigns run, great candidate selection as well. But I think like the reason you'd see those in the in the Labor gain seats and swings towards us on our primary is because people were determined to change the election. Now, if you look at the collapse of the Liberal primary in those seats, it didn't come across holus bolus to us. It did fracture and splinter and then come back on 2BP, but we got a slice of it on the way through.
And the biggest slice,
and the biggest slice on the way through, and those sort of threes and fours coming off the like the 10-point collapse from the Liberal Party. So I think part of that is just the benefit of people wanting to turf out the incumbent, and knowing to do that they had to go to the other major party to do so. I think that's how I'd say it. In terms of the bigger, broader question, and we were sort of saying this beforehand as well, it's the I've never seen the degree of introspection after a victory that we're going through now, and I reckon that's a good thing. I think that's a good thing, and I think it's good for us to be not just sitting back on our heels and going, we're absolute geniuses. We turned a low 30s primary nationwide into a majority government. We must be master strategists. Like there's a good and healthy degree of looking under the hood of this result from different commentators, and also within the show as well. I don't know what it all means just yet. I don't have a firm view about what it all means. There's you can see a scenario where this is the splintering of the two party system. There's a scenario you can see where this is the last majority government of any persuasion for the next 2 decades or so. I've been saying to people, like, there's a reason the Free Traders and the Protectionists merged in 1909 and formed the Commonwealth Liberals, and it's because it was a 3-horse race of us, the Free Traders and the Protectionists, and no one could quite work out how to get there in their own right. And two legs of that stool decided that they wanted to lock out Labor, and so they merged together in the fusion and created the Commonwealth Liberals, and the Country Party bumbled its way along at some stage as well. So there's a possibility we're sitting in a similar sort of moment. I've seen some commentators refer to it as akin to the creation of the Democrats. I think it's bigger than that. Some people have spoken about the different ALP split, the two splits. It's probably more. It feels more akin to that, though, on the non-Labor side of the fence. So I think there's a big question that is sort of sitting in front of all of us, which is what is the future constituency of a majority government look like? And I don't think anyone has the perfect answer for that. And part of it is as much about form and style as it is about different policy attributes as well. I think there'll be a big debate, obviously, about climate and both rhetoric and policy settings on climate over the course of this term. I think that'll be a big part of the conversation. But I think an even bigger part of the conversation is running good, competent, sensible government. Something that's been missing, and stable government, which has been missing. Scott Morrison was the first Prime Minister to go to re-election, having been elected at the previous election since 2007. There's been a huge period of instability in our national politics, on top of a global pandemic. So I think there is I'm rambling a little bit because I don't know all the answers, and I don't think anyone knows all the answers just yet. But there's a big part of it, which is running good, competent government for a period of 3 years, when we're going to be facing economic conditions which are, horrendous and very, very challenging. But running good, stable, trusted, respected government with some integrity underpinning it as well has got to be part of the answer.
I think that the two things I've taken from, and I'm with you, I don't know, my thoughts on this aren't fully formed. And a part of the reason why I'm doing this podcast is I want to sit down with folks like yourself and have a bit of a chat about it, and get other people's insights. But as I'm doing this, two immediate takeaways come to mind. The first one is that, and I don't know and maybe you can answer this, I don't know the level of what the field program looked like in places like Reid and Bennelong and Robertson, but I can only assume that there was definitely direct voter contact going on.
Yeah, heavy amounts, and in Gilmore as well, I should add, which we'll come back to a bit later on. But heavy amounts of door knocking, phone calling, direct voter contact, well and truly.
So, if you are having conversations with undecided or persuadable voters on their doorstep or on their telephone over an extended period of time, and actually having values-based persuasion conversations that go to the root of their concerns about their community, then you are in a better position to win the hearts and minds and get their first preference, not what they're going to do later down the ballot paper, but their first preference.
Yeah.
And so we've seen that in places like Reid, Bennelong and Robertson, and the seats I've mentioned down in Victoria. If you don't do that, and you're just relying on a national media campaign or paid advertising on TV, then maybe you throw out a couple of Facebook ads here and there. But if you do that, but if you're not actually speaking to people, and also the research backs that up, which someone gave me shit on Twitter the other day because they asked me what was the research. So I'm not freaking telling you. I'll tell you. Our opponents, what our research tells us, but believe me, okay, it moves votes. Yep. That's all you need to know, right? But if you're not having those conversations, then voters will consider something else. And I think that what we saw from all of the polling leading up to Election Day, was that there was the primary vote for Labor and the primary vote for the Liberal Party were both low for the Liberal Party substantially lower in the polls. And the others, and by that I mean all non-Labor or non-coalition parties, were uncharacteristically high, and it didn't drop once pre-poll happened. I was saying on the podcast, we're going to see these numbers fall, because what happens is people start to make up their minds and they go, right, I'll go vote. And when they do get research or surveyed, they give the answer that they, who they voted for. It never really fell. And on election day, basically a lot of voters went, I'm going one Green or One Nation or Palmer or some independent. And then I'll make sure that Labor is ahead of the Tories on my ballot paper. And so we saw swings against us on our primary, but it swings to us on our 2PP. And why they did that, that's the answer. I don't know the question. And I'm wondering, to your second point, if the Albanese Labor government is an excellent government over the next 3 years and is seen to be, and I think that the secret source of what we've seen from all of our state governments is that they get shit done.
Yep. And
voters go, oh, they're not getting in my grill, but I'm looking around and I'm seeing stuff getting done in my community. I'm pretty happy about that. So I'm happy with them. You know what? I'm going to vote one Labor. And then I think that the next election, if they do that, then we'll start to see all of those voters that gave us a second or third or fourth preference over the Liberals, but they'll come back to us. Yep. Would be my theory of change anyway that I'm coming up with at the moment. I want to get your thoughts on that.
So one way that I've been thinking about the Teal seats and Fowler, to be honest, we should put that on the table, is one model I've got in my head of thinking about those is they were effectively large-scale community pre-selections where people in those communities looked at the offering that they had and weren't happy with what the major party had offered them. And so they found another way. And so like the through line of what happened in those 4 seats in New South Wales, but also to your point about direct voter contact and what is it's not saying it's not necessarily all about the exact policy offering, but a structure and substance of person as well. And you're saying about, I think sometimes we make the mistake in elections and analysis to remove the concept of a community from the individual candidate, whereas candidates who are of and from and in their own communities, they don't think about it in terms of, I'm going to direct voter contact with my community to see what they want. It's, well, I know what they want because, I'm in the front bar of the Ryans. I'm down at the RSL. I'm, my kids go to school here, whatever, whatever touch points you've got. Yep. And people can suss that out. And instinctively, then a good MP will be representative of and reflective of and in touch and in tune with their electorates. And I think what we saw happen, particularly in those three Teal seats, incumbents who the community said, well, no, you don't actually reflect us and represent us. And because of all the wonderful, advances in social media and community connectivity, and probably some shared experiences through COVID lockdowns as well, people have found ways to organise in ways that, and this is your domain, not mine, but 20 years ago it would have been quite hard to think of the sheer scale of the independent campaigns being able to self-organise so rapidly. But I think that's some big advancements in digital communication and connectivity there as well. So yeah, part of me is, and that's where I think that's the big lesson for all of us. Simon Birmingham said something really really clever on the Sunday morning Insiders after the day after the election. And he said, and I don't often quote Liberals as being smart, but I'll credit this. He said in 2019, the Liberal Party had a mask and a message. And the mask or the masking effect was the fact that people were voting against the Labor policy offering, particularly on different taxation changes. but the message for the Liberal Party was sitting in the seat of Warringah. And they convinced themselves that they lost Warringah because of the unpopularity of Tony Abbott. But Birmingham's view was that they had missed the actual message of the 2019 election. The signal and the noise. They missed the signal. And where I think for 2022, I think there's a giant masking effect. We can't argue. There's a giant masking effect of people disliking Scott Morrison and the government that he was running and the way that he was running it and all the issues and all the policies that he was out of touch on. But I wonder whether there's a message sitting in Fowler for us as well, and also sitting in those teal seats of if you don't reflect and be responsive to the communities which you're seeking to represent or do represent, they work you out. And it happens much, much quicker and much, much more effectively now than sort of ever before. And so I think that's the big takeaway message for me is, the masking effect we can't miss, which is, you can't run a government as badly as Scott Morrison and get away with it. But also the message sitting in, you've got to get candidate selection right. And you've got to represent that in the sort of people who seek to represent their communities, and they need to be of their communities.
In organising, when we talk about developing a leadership structure of people from within the constituency, and by leader, I don't mean, when we think of leader, we probably think of a politician or a mayor or something. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about sort of voluntary leadership. When developing that leadership structure, it has to be from the constituency. And what we want to avoid, and it sometimes happens, is a thing called leadership island, where you get those leaders and you bring them together and they start working as a team, which is great. But then they remove themselves from that constituency through no longer being in dialogue with them on a regular basis and creating communication flows through finding new leadership and enabling them. I mean, organising is about enabling others to achieve shared purpose. So that leadership it's on them it's their responsibility to enable others. And we see, to your point, we see that a lot in politics, is that when they get elected, they create, without probably even realising that they're doing it, they create their own leadership island, and they just almost accidentally excommunicate themselves from their constituency.
Yeah.
Clearly the Liberals have done that in their heartland, and they've just taken it for granted, thinking, to quote Donald Trump, I can go out and, shoot X amount of people and still, they kind of did that without without picking up a AR-15, metaphorically speaking, of course. And yeah, you're right. I think there's a lesson for Labor as well in that. And if I was a safe Labor MP, state or federal, I would be starting to reconsider, what am I doing to engage with my constituency, and not in a tokenistic bullshit like tick in a box engagement. I mean, do I know what the challenges and problems that my community face?
Yeah.
Have I worked out how I can work with them to solve those problems? How can I enable other leadership within my community? And then get organised, basically. And I know this is a blatantly biased organising podcast, so I always think the answer to everything is always organising, but it helps, right? And we're not seeing that. And to my point to the start of this conversation was, in Bennelong and Reid and Robertson, even though it's mobilising, it probably isn't organising in the true sense of the word. At least there were people going out there and having a conversation with voters and saying, hey, these are the challenges in your life. I think the answer will be for you anyway in 3 or 4 weeks' time is to vote for the Labor candidate.
Yeah.
If you're not doing that everywhere, then we're going to get those kind of swings against us on our primary vote. We're just lucky they came back to us on the 2PP.
Yeah.
Before we talk about Before we talk about Fowler, give me your thoughts on Gilmore. So let's wrap up the positives from the campaign.
Gilmore, which is, let me just pull it up because it's updating fairly rapidly. Gilmore, we are currently ahead by 373 votes in Gilmore, which is tremendous. And we spoke about it on election night itself, but it was remiss of me not to talk about it in more detail, or some of the more contextual factors on our pre-election podcast. 2019, talk about the message sitting in there. The Liberal Party pre-selection mess of Gilmore in 2019, which you would think would have been a clarion call to get your pre-selection house in order. Instead, they just sort of exported that model across the entire state with all of their pre-selections. But anyway, so in 2019, there was the endorsed Liberal candidate who had been imposed upon the branch in Warren Mundine. There was a National Party candidate in a former state minister of high profile, Katrina Hodgkinson, running for the Nationals. There was a ex-Liberal Party member, Grant Schultz, running as a independent, overtly on the platform of being a disaffected ex-Liberal Party member who didn't get pre-selection, effectively, all running. And then, so that just sort of ate away at the Liberal primary, and through heavy preference leakage and swings and roundabouts, we sort of shot up through there. So when we came to face 22, the Andrew Constance effect, I think people mistook that for being, they've got a high profile celebrity candidate who was the state transport minister, and whose prior electorate somewhat overlapped the seat of Gilmore. They'll do very well because of him. Well, the real story, and this is why it's sort of remarkable, the effort that we've done there to be narrowly ahead, and looks like we're going to continue to be ahead, is really because there was a mass consolidation of the non-Labor vote back around a single candidate. You didn't have that sort of three-way split dividing the vote this time. You had all what should have been, in normal circumstances, you would have thought a snapback or reversion back to a Liberal held seat, because you had those three consolidating back, so you're not worried about preference leakage anymore, because that primary is all coming back in. Not to be. So there was also an independent running this time around, who picked up a bit of that Liberal chaos vote from last time. But effectively, you saw the Liberal primary came back, but they didn't get all of it back over the course of those 3 years, and that's how Fiona's been able to pull off a remarkable victory and get us to 77.
It's actually an interesting seat that folks should ever take a look at. You're right, actually, because from the 2019 campaign, the national, with no candidate running from the National Party, there's a collapse of 12. That was worth 12.5% in a primary. The Libs have gone to 12.8. There's obviously others in the 2019 campaign was worth 8.8%, and then that's kind of been divvied up now between an independent and a One Nation candidate. They're both respectively on a sort of 4.2, 4.0. And there's been a slight swing to the Greens of 0.3%, and the slight swing against Labor on a primary 0.2. And whatever's happened in the sort of the distribution of all of those non-Labor, independent One Nation candidates, it's just done enough to put Fiona over the top, which is a remarkable effort.
Yeah. So, and without having seen some of those, the One Nation UAP or the Independent how to vote cards, or the Liberal Dem how to vote cards, I think it's all of their primaries are all looking at now. They're all sub 4%. So they've just sort of splintered away, and we've sort of soaked up enough in enough places. I suspect some of them didn't have preferences listed, and clearly weren't followed if they did. And obviously the Green vote has just increased enough there, and you would expect that we would have picked up a good bit of flow out of that. But it's sort of a remarkable story, that one, of sort of defying the odds of both, mathematics, and then on top of it, a what was seen to be a high profile candidate. And last time I was on, I went through the litany of failures of him as a state transport minister, so people can go back and listen to that one again.
Any other pluses for Labor out of the result before we move to some of the deltas?
No, look, we've covered the high ground. Obviously, I think there was some consternation or concern about the seat of Parramatta going in. That ended up on a 2PP basis, ended up on an increase on 2PP, and having seen the campaign that he ran with the time available, and also what he's been doing since becoming the member for Parramatta, Andrew Charlton is building very strong community linkages, and I think some of the things we've been talking about around community organising and engagement is, from the bits and pieces that I'm seeing, he's starting the work, and he knows he's got some big work ahead of him. But that was one that we were obviously concerned about. The a couple of the other amazing wins and things to think about. I've been watching the AEC declaration process, and some of them just absolutely make me smile, of the combination of seats that are being declared together. Like Eden Monaro we haven't spoken about Eden Monaro, and that used to be, how many, column pages were dedicated to hand-wringing about Eden Monaro. I think Macquarie, and forgive me, I get this wrong, I think the seat of Macquarie got declared on the same day as the seat of Cook, which, Macquarie was, I think the margin was 0.9%. It was one of the most marginal in the state, if not the most marginal Labor seat, maybe up there with Gilmore. They probably would have been very, very similar. We haven't spoken about it at all because the result was so strong and definitive there. So some of our holds of some slim 2019 results can't be passed by either.
Let's talk about Fowler, and I'll do my best David Feeney impersonation.
I know who Donnelly is this time. There you go.
Yeah, I know. That was one of the weird things about that night was, we're not prepped with as much information as, say, some of the guys on the main networks are. But we were scratching around trying to find some stuff about some seats that I did not think was going to be a talking point. And Fowler obviously was one of them. My question to you about Fowler is, the narrative is that, and I think there's strong merit in it, that, if you treat an electorate or a community with disrespect in the way that you plant a candidate on top of them and say, right now, go vote for them, that you're going to get stuck, or it's going to come unstuck. However, we've done this before, and we did it in this election as well.
Yeah.
And there are examples of it in New South Wales, and there are examples of it in Victoria. Yet Christina come unstuck. What's the difference, do you think?
I honestly don't think that I'll say what I don't think. I think the difference is not the individual candidate that we selected. And Christina Keneally is a former premier of our state, was deputy leader in the Senate, has made a outstandingly positive Labor contribution, and that shouldn't be missed on the way through this. And none of this is a reflection on her, I don't think. I think there is a bit of confluence and circumstance of the things that we were talking about found its way to the forefront in Fowler. But to be honest, it could have happened elsewhere. So that's why I'm saying it's not about. I've seen some of the commentary, and I think it's unfair. I think that some of the commentary has focused more on the individual than on the tides around. And frankly, had this happened in other parts of the state or in Victoria, it could have happened there as well. I think what was saying about the teal seats and others around, if the community forms a view that it doesn't like the option being presented to it, and it's organised enough, it can find a way, and it find a way around that. And that's what occurred in Fowler. I think also, the unique structural position of Fowler as compared to, other communities, including, Parramatta, for example. Um, Fowler has a more single homogenous, non-white population, whereas seats of other seats, which are equally, what we would call, multicultural, have more combinations of different cultural groupings sitting within them, whereas Fowler obviously has a very strong Vietnamese population. And I think, that community then having an option presented to it of a high-profile independent with a previous record of that in that community, and being of and representative of that community, was able to organise in very quick and short order. And, we can't deny sitting on top of that as well was a very public, noisy pre-selection process, which also had interaction with that cultural grouping as well. So I do think that, like I said, there is definitely a message for Labor sitting in that. I at pains to say that it is not reflective of Christina Keneally as a individual or a candidate or as a phenomenal Labor woman who's made a huge contribution to the show. And I'm sure we'll find other ways to make contributions to the state and to the nation. But I do think it's representative of what happens if we just get the play wrong.
Looking to the future, where does what does New South Wales state Labor take from this result? We got a state poll in March next year.
Yeah. I think there's a few things all sort of rolling along, going into the state election. There's you can run through the exercise of overlaying federal results onto state seats and sort of trying to cast some sort of divine wisdom from that. On that basis, I think I said on the night in Epping, which is Perrottet's seat, there were massive swings against. Do I think that Perrottet is going to lose his seat at the state election? Probably not. So I think we can. I honestly didn't see a lot of overlap between the two campaigns. I think the lessons for state Labor in New South Wales going into the next election is all the things we've been talking about: good community organising, good community engagement, picking the right issues, and presenting good, competent leadership. I think we've got that in spades with Chris Minns. I think he's picking the right issue on, particularly on cost of living, on tolls and fines, and the like. And as we get closer, we'll roll out some more policy offerings there as well. We're seeing quite a degree of industrial action at the moment in New South Wales, particularly from I think the public servants are out today, the public sector unions out today. But we're seeing that in our railway workers, in nurses and paramedics, in teachers, and that is as much an articulation of frustration and the pain that people are going through on cost of living at the moment. And if the state government is continues to be out of touch on those issues, then that will be fertile ground for state Labor. And then on top of that, I think some of the state governments, effectively like the state government's record in infrastructure is starting to come undone through different crunches, and they're pushing off projects that were previously slated and sort of abandoning different projects, and they're losing some of the credible capital they had on those issues. And then I'm I'm resisting the urge to hook into the transport portfolio again, but effectively there's a whole range of ways that on basic service delivery in the transport portfolio as well that the state government is letting the people of New South Wales down in an area which, frankly, in a playbook stolen from us in running a good centrist government under obviously that started with Bob Carr. I think their credibility on those issues is coming to a close. But it is a really tricky, and we'll have to pour through it another time, but it is a really tricky election for Labor. The combination and the location of the sort of seats that we need to pick up and the places we need to pick up are non-homogenous. They're all over the state. But then again, we picked up the seat of Bega for the first time in New South Wales history at a by-election recently. But we did it because we chose a good local community candidate in Dr. Michael Holland. So there is a pathway there for us, but I don't see a lot of overlap between the two elections. What I see is sort of a back to that form and structure and style, and I think that Chris Minns and the team are on the right path there.
If you're looking at the electoral map federally for the 2025 election in New South Wales, is your campaign strategy simply to hold what we've got, so those 26 seats, or have we gleaned anything from the shake-up of the electorate from this election that suggests that there are new areas where Labor can focus its resources to, if not jag a seat in the 2025 election, but you can start to see that there is a change in attitudes or the demographics. I hate using that term, demographics, but like where is there fertile ground in New South Wales for Labor to make new inroads into picking up new seats?
The one that comes to mind is I'd love to see us. It's actually a win back, but from so long ago now that maybe it feels like new ground. I'd love to see us get back the seat of Banks. We put in a really strong effort this time, but the circumstances just didn't cut our way enough. So Banks would be one you'd like to see. I think for majority on the Labor side, we're at a very, very healthy position. To be honest, on the other side of the ledger, the pathway for the Liberals is atrocious, and a seat that didn't get remarked upon, but was nearly an upset on the night. The seat of Bradfield, which is the St Ives part of the world and surrounds. That 2BP is now, unless it's been updated, but that 2BP is now against an independent who got close. I think in the end it was the Liberals retained it with Paul Fletcher, but the independent there gave it a run for their money, and I don't think they had particularly deep pockets or big backing in that particular seat. I think it was just another demonstration of once blue ribbon Liberal Party seats not feeling particularly well represented by the offering in front of them. So I can see, with the exception of Banks and I'm trying to think around the map, it kind of feels like we're at a bit of a we're at a high watermark, or at least at a healthy watermark in the state of New South Wales. The seat of North Sydney is really interesting. And again, forgive me if I get this wrong, but from memory, the Greens didn't preference us second. They preferenced the Independent second in North Sydney, which had that flipped around the other way. That was a genuine 3-horse race that could have gone our way. Now that they've got a Teal Independent, I think that would be an unlikely gain for us there. But again, if this election has taught us anything, communities will judge you on the basis of your performance over the past 3 years. So if various independent members don't perform, and as to your point, if the Labor government is performing well, delivering good services, rolling out good infrastructure, being competent, doing the job that it's meant to do, there could be fertile ground in parts of the state that we wouldn't otherwise have thought possible by virtue of, they've abandoned the Liberal Party and they're looking for someone to do a good job. They'll be judging these 3 years pretty carefully, I would have thought.
And we'll obviously watch closely as that story unfolds over the course of the term of the Albanese Labor government, which is a wonderful sentence to say. Elliot, once again, thank you very much for your time and your insights into the campaign, particularly in your home state of New South Wales. We appreciate you coming back on the show, and I dare say that we'll have you back on as we get closer and closer to the New South Wales state campaign in March next year. Thanks very much for coming on.
Really looking forward to it, and thanks again for having me.
Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcast or Podchaser. And to get all the latest on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday.